Good evening. Can you all hear me? Welcome. Welcome to Vine Street. My name is Melissa Freeman, and I am the chair of our administrative council here and also a longtime member of this congregation. So I'm very excited y'all are all here. And I'm really excited that Carol Busey is here with us this evening to talk with us about our city and this 200 years that it has grown up and become what it is today. And so I think that's just terrific. Before we get into all of that, a couple of housekeeping notes. One, if you have your cell phone on, if you don't mind turning it off, please. We don't want to be interrupted with 2021 in 1820 when we're hearing about that. And then if you have need for the restroom, it's through those doors, down the hall and to the right. So thank you again for being here, and to the folks at home who are watching via live stream, we're excited to have you all here. Before we get started, a couple things. You have a little flyer here that we gave you when you came in that has some of our other anniversary plans that we have going on. And I just want to tell you about them because I'm really excited about them. On the 23rd of October, which is a Saturday afternoon, we are going to have a festival out on our west lawn here. And we're going to have live music and food trucks and things for the kids to do, and it'll just be a really fun time with our neighbors and with the community. And then on the next day, on Sunday, we're having our celebration worship service, and after that service, we will be down in our fellowship hall downstairs for a reception, and Phil Ponder will be here, and he will be unveiling his new masterpiece, which is a painting of this church, which we are so very excited about. So I think that is it. Right now, I'm going to ask Martha Bishop to come up. She's going to tell us about our special guest, and we'll get started. Thank you all for being here.
To have Dr. Carol Busey as our speaker tonight and next Wednesday night is a real treat. I envy Dr. Busey's students at Volunteer State Community College, where she teaches history. Those of us who cannot take her courses can read books that she has written or to which she has contributed. A book that I brought tonight is The Nashville City Cemetery, History Carved in Stone. From one page in this book, I learned that the first 4 acres that were purchased for the city cemetery were purchased in 1820, the year our Vine Street congregation was founded, and that the word cemetery derives from the Greek word for sleep chamber. She also has led very popular tours of the old cemetery where many of Nashville's early leaders and other folks are buried. Her 2-volume Tennessee Through Time is used as 4th and 5th grade textbooks across the state. Again, lucky students. Other books include Tennessee, The Civil War Years, A Path Divided, those are two different books. A Path Divided, Tennessee Civil War Years, and Women Helping Women, the YWCA of Nashville, 1898 to 1998. Other writings and lectures include several on women's suffrage, as well as the Equal Rights Amendment, Tennessee on the Eve of World War I, and Tennessee Women Challenging Southern Church Patriarchy. She has taught at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute of Vanderbilt University and teaches Nashville 101 and 102 each year. In 2010, Mayor Carl Dean named her Metropolitan Nashville Davidson County Historian. She's Vice President of the Tennessee Historical Society. Besides her undergraduate degree from Baylor University, she has a master's from George Peabody College and a PhD from Vanderbilt University. She and her husband are members of our neighbor church, Westminster Presbyterian. Welcome, Dr. Carol Busey.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you. The honor and pleasure of coming to do this talk tonight is all mine. I really am delighted to be here and to see so many faces that I know from so many different walks of life. And so tonight I want to take a little time to tell you what was going on here in Nashville. And we can't really compare the times. They don't really exactly sync up, but you'll see some things that you probably will understand and say, maybe that's where we are today. And so history, as Mark Twain said, it doesn't repeat itself, but indeed it does rhyme. And so we will be talking about Nashville. And 1820 really was a major point in the history of Nashville. It had been a frontier town of sorts, barely holding on. The people who came here and settled this area were absolutely the most adventurous and bravest people you can possibly imagine. Imagine 1779, there is a Revolutionary War going on across the mountains, and about 200 plus people decided that they were going to leave over there and come over here and plant a settlement. And they were doing this for one very important reason: opportunity. Now, these people who came, the Robertsons, the Donaldsons, most of you know a good bit of this story, they were people of faith. But they didn't come over here immediately to build churches. They came over here to hold on to this land, and it was very hard because the Chickamaugans, a hostile branch of the Cherokees, who had realized that these settlers are going to never be satisfied with the amount of land they take, the Chickamaugans contested the settlements almost as soon as the Donaldson party arrived. Indeed, it was so heavily contested, so many of the original settlers were killed in Indian attacks that the Donaldson family left and went back up to Kentucky, where they thought it was going to be safer. So contesting this land was a very challenging thing for the settlers who felt that they had bought it from the Native Americans, and for the Chickamaugans who said, these folks are never, ever going to be satisfied. Now that my clicker that was working a while ago is not working, I'll move over here. How about that? So let's see if we can get it to click here. Maybe my PowerPoint is frozen. Let's see. It may be the PowerPoint. You know, technology is great when it works. And it's not so great when it doesn't work. Okay, I think we've got it unfrozen now. But you all aren't the frozen chosen. The Presbyterians have that. You all are not the frozen chosen. You are much more lively than they are. So, nonetheless, here these folks come, and I tell you, as the more mature I become, the more interested I am in geography. And now, anytime I go down a hill, I think about, I wonder how high the water of Sugar Tree Creek gets there on Bowling when you have that little dip there. And I'm very conscious of geography in a way that I wasn't in my younger days. So let's look here at this map. Now, this is the Cumberland River. This map was done in the 1880s, but it really does show you what this area looked like. You've got all of these bends in this river here, and James Robertson picked a very specific spot for planting his new settlement, which was between a salt creek that flowed into the Cumberland River from, let's just say, the Bicentennial Mall. There was a salt lick there. This whole area was full of salt licks. And then Browns Creek, which flows into the river about where the Skirmerhorn is today. They are both under conduits today, but that's where those creeks were. And he picked this identifiable spot. And people spread out. They were claiming land. These people wanted the land. And think about these women. I mean, they had children to take care of. They had to feed their family. What a harrowing experience this must have been as they came in not knowing what to expect. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. Most of these people who came were Scots-Irish, not all, but many were Scots-Irish, and they weren't necessarily Presbyterians, but they were of that family tree of John Calvin, where the Christian church, the Presbyterian church, the Baptist church, all are part of that Calvinist tradition. And so they came here and they will start trying to establish themselves. But goodness gracious, how hard it was. They got Thomas Malloy to draw them a plat of what they hoped to be a town. Now, this took some imagination because this was the end of the world. It really was the gateway to the West for a little bit of time. So here you see why the streets in Nashville are also unpredictable, because they were laid out parallel to the Cumberland River. So that's a joke. They really weren't. That's a joke. But nonetheless, they're going to have a public square here. They're going to have Market Street, 2nd Avenue, which has been in the news quite a bit this year. And then they name all of these streets. Now, High Street here, which is going to be a part of Vine Street's church, the church's history, High Street really led ultimately up to this hill where the state capitol is. It was called Campbell's Knob. And then here is High Street, and it led up to that. And then you have Vine Street, and it's my understanding that Vine Street was named for a street in Philadelphia. Some of the folks had come from Philadelphia. And then you have these cross streets here. You have these various cross streets, and so it was laid out to be a town, and people were buying these lots, and they allotted a good portion of land a little bit further than this for an educational institution. These people were very interested in education. The people who signed the Cumberland Compact in 1780, almost all of those men, there were 250 or so men who put their names on the compact, and almost every one of them could write their name. There was only one or two that had to put a mark because they could not write their names. Now that was the desire. The grid was the desire. This was the reality. Tennessee becomes a state in 1796. There is no state capital at this point. This map was drawn much later than 1804, but it was drawn to look like Nashville looked in 1804. And you see here, we've got Market Street with businesses up and down the street. You've got the Nashville Inn. You've got some things here. You see the college, and you see a few other things. But it was a very, very slow start, even after statehood. The town grew slowly. It just had lots of different issues, and people were afraid to come over here. Statehood really boosted the population, but it grows slowly and gradually, ever so gradually, begins to increase. Now, the original settlers, the people who put their names on the Cumberland Compact, did not become really, really wealthy in land speculation, which was what they were all hoping to do, is buy land very cheaply and sell it and use the land as capital, sell it, and make a profit. And they weren't able to do that. But they did finally begin to get established. The last Indian fighting that took place with our people here in the Cumberland settlements was in 1794. And that was the last one, but there were still a lot of issues with Indian relations as these settlers just insisted on spreading out. Now, Tennessee becomes a state in 1796. We are part of the United States. The United States is under the Constitution. And over here in the West, this suddenly becomes a potential opportunity for evangelism. And so here you've got not a lot of churches, not a lot of preachers, and you see this great awakening as this period in history that really begins about the time Tennessee became a state and goes on up through Vine Street's founding. Here you've got this religious revival. Now, the denomination that took the most advantage of this was the Methodist. They were not descendants of John Calvin, keep in mind. Their ancestor is the Church of England. They are organized like the Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church, and they were able to take advantage of this. Their ministers did not have to have an education. They were able to ride through these very far-spaced communities, and they brought something to these people who were virtually living alone on the frontier. They brought something to them that was nourishment for them, and they were very effective at planting churches. The first church in Nashville itself was a Methodist church that was temporarily, anyway, down on the square. They didn't last very long, but they did have a church, and McKendree Methodist considers that church to be their ancestor church. And so the circuit riders were doing a lot of preaching, and you know, the Baptists and the Presbyterians are around, and some Presbyterians will indeed decide they're going to try this. They were not quite so good at the evangelism part as were the Baptists. But nonetheless, when the leaders of this community, Nashville, really feel they've got things kind of under control, the first thing they decide to do is create a school. And Presbyterians did have kind of a lock on education in what is now East Tennessee, as well as here in Middle Tennessee. And so they find a Presbyterian minister who is ordained. He's a graduate of the College of Princeton, and his name is Thomas Craighead. He is brought here to open a school, which becomes known as Davidson Academy. He was a preacher. He did preach on occasion, but he was brought here to operate this school. The school had all sorts of financial problems. It's up and down, and a school where people have to pay tuition in the frontier is really a very problematic exercise to take care of. So here you don't see that spawning any Presbyterian churches. Indeed, they were kind of the last to get themselves kind of going and established here. The first church in Davidson County was indeed the Mill Creek Baptist Church. Now, Mill Creek is over towards, I guess, Antioch, and the best way I can describe where the Mill Creek Church is to say, if you were going towards the Nashville airport on I-40, and you come to where 24 splits off to go to Murfreesboro, right in this corner where the interstate is now you're going to go to Murfreesboro, that is where the Mill Creek Baptist Church was established. There is still a graveyard there. And James Whitsitt, a Baptist, started this church and established this congregation. You know, some of you, I bet, have read the novels of Dr. Alfred Leland Crabb. And, you know, Dr. Crabb taught at Peabody and I think possibly some other places in the 1950s, and he wrote lots and lots of novels. And they were all were historical novels. And my idea of Dr. Crabb is sitting out in the Nashville Cemetery with the sexton. There is an office there, but there is no sexton anymore. And he would sit there and he would look at the gravestones and let his imagination just soar to the heavens, because there are a lot of stories at the city cemetery that have no documentation about these particular people. But nonetheless, one of the things that he is alleged to have said is that the Presbyterians and the Baptists had an agreement that the Presbyterians would keep the city if the Baptists could keep all of the countryside. And so Richland Creek had a Baptist church, Mill Creek had a Baptist church, but there were no Presbyterian churches around who were thriving at all. And here you have these camp meetings. Can you imagine how much fun this might have been, especially if you were a child? Your family's going to camp out. You're going to have not only the Holy Spirit moving in the crowd, you're going to have some other hard spirits in jugs moving around the crowd. You've got people who have any kind of musical instrument who are there to play. These camp meetings must have been fun. There was a campground up in Goodlettsville. There were a couple in Sumner County. And the main thrust of these camp meetings was over the border up in Kentucky. So Mill Creek, thanks to Reverend Whitsitt, gets its church going out there, and they establish themselves, and ultimately the Tennessee Baptist Convention, which is not really a governing board because the Baptist churches are congregational and each church is more or less autonomous. The convention is a loose gathering of Baptist churches, and it was founded out there in that area, in that church as well. Now, suddenly, the biggest institutions here will become two things: the militia and the Masonic Lodge. Now, the militia was written into the Cumberland Compact. Everybody male of a certain age has to be in the militia because they were indeed fighting Native Americans to try to hold on to this land. Now, the Masonic Lodge gets here pretty quickly too, and it gets organized down at the courthouse and is established really before Tennessee became a state. We had the St. Tammany Lodge #1, which had been organized by the Grand Lodge of North Carolina, our mother state. And it got its name changed to the Harmony Lodge in 1800. I would love to know why. And then it ultimately dissolved. Now, you know, there was a time in rural Tennessee and in all of the rural towns in the South especially, where the Masonic Lodge was a premier organization within any community. It was an important feature of every community, and communities certainly wanted to have their own lodge within that particular community. It was really, I think I've read that it was more or less a secularized version of Christianity. They were also very interested in schools. They established some schools. Hartsville, they established a school in Hartsville, one in Gallatin. And then they get themselves, I don't know what happened to them, but they ended up dissolving. And so they will not get another lodge here until 1812. But this is when the story starts really picking up, 1812. So we've got the Masonic Lodge here, and they will build this hall about the time that Vine Street gets its congregation gets planted and starts up as well. And so now back to the militia. The militia was a political organization without being political. All of the men are in it, but the difference between the militia and the regular army is that the militia is they elect their own officers. The militia elects the officers going up and down the totem pole, and they're volunteers, whereas the army are professionals. So the militia here was always very important, and the big position, I guess second when Tennessee became a state, second to being governor of Tennessee, would being the major general of the Tennessee militia. And Andrew Jackson beat John Sevier out of that position about 1803, really intensifying this East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee relationship, this contest between the two. But Andrew Jackson becomes the major general of the militia. Now, Andrew Jackson had come to town before statehood, but after North Carolina had created Davidson County, He had come because his friend John McNary had been appointed the county judge. If you're going to have a county, you've got to have a county court, and you're going to have a judge. So North Carolina's legislature had appointed John McNary. He needs a lawyer. You're going to have somebody to try the cases. And indeed, Andrew Jackson said, well, I'll come. So they come from over in East Tennessee over here. Andrew Jackson opens a law office, very lucrative business because so many people are arguing about what land is mine and what land is yours and what land are we going to sell to somebody else. So there were lots of land claim disputes in the county court here. But Andrew Jackson is the Major General of the militia. Now, the big thing here is land speculation. And with the invention of the cotton gin, suddenly all of this land west of Nashville, from the Tennessee River in the west, over there about where Waverly is, all the way to the Mississippi River, that land suddenly looks really, really like a great opportunity to raise cotton. The only problem is that has been reserved for the Chickasaw tribe. Now, below us here, let's start about, well, let's say Columbia and go further south and down into Alabama. That also looks like really, really great land for which you can raise a lot of cotton, and cotton translates to making a lot of money. Cotton is a labor-intensive crop, so once we start raising cotton anywhere around here, you know what number is going to dramatically rise: the number of enslaved people here. Now let's look at these maps for just a minute. This is Tennessee before statehood. We are, at this point, no longer part of North Carolina. We are the territory south of the River Ohio. We have 4 counties in East Tennessee and 3 here in Middle Tennessee: Sumner, Davidson, and Tennessee County. This little invisible line here is between what's reserved for all of the Native Americans is actually called the Tennessee Ridge. And all of the water on the western side of this line goes to the Tennessee River, and all of the water on the eastern side goes to the Cumberland River. It's right down the middle of the land between the lakes. So here you see all of this land, before we become a state, being reserved for Native Americans. Well, look what happens when we become a state. Suddenly we've got lots more counties over here in the middle, and we're pushing beyond that Tennessee divide. Let's go back. We're pushing on down. So in 1800, Tennessee is a state, and look at all the counties we've got. And what once was Tennessee County is now Robertson County and Stewart County. 1800, got it? Okay, 1810. Look what has happened. 1810, we are all the way to the 35th parallel, our southern border. The Cherokees are holding on over here more than any other tribe. They accommodated, they compromised, they cooperated with the settlers, trying to hold on to some part of their ancestral homeland. And indeed, they held on to a good part of their ancestral homeland up until the 1830s. So 1810 comes along, and now we've got folks really looking down here at Alabama and Mississippi at that beautiful land that is being unused in the opinion of potential settlers. We have people over here on the Duck River, and the Cherokees are here, the Creeks are down in here, and we've got the Chickasaws over here. So up in the Ohio region, a Shawnee chieftain, Tecumseh, says, if the tribes do not unite, we will not survive. He even comes south and meets with the tribal leaders in the southern tribes, saying, we've got to come together. We've got to come together. And we've got to push any new settlers out and not let the settlers take any more of our land. Well, that's easier said than done, and the tribes have to weigh individually what's going on, and the Creeks were very divided. Do we have peace or do we go to war? And especially they were divided when a group of settlers come down here into into kind of the middle part, I guess, of Alabama and start clearing land, and they will have a military fort there called Fort Mims. And so the hostile Creeks decide right then and there that they have got to push those settlers at Fort Mims out. And indeed, they attack the fort, and they kill women, children, they kill pretty much everybody. And so, of course, that word gets to Tennessee very quickly. Now, meanwhile, up in the Ohio region, the Native Americans up there are trying to resist. And so here we've got in Congress a bunch of people that are now going to be called the War Hawks. Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Felix Grundy from Tennessee, they say we need to go to war, not with the tribes necessarily, we're already fighting them, with England. Now, if there was ever a war that we were not prepared for, it was the War of 1812. We had no standing army. We didn't know exactly what we were fighting for, but up in the Great Lakes area, we felt that the British up in Canada were selling guns and weapons to the Native Americans and encouraging them to fight the American settlers. And so that seemed to be the reason enough, and Congress votes to declare war on Great Britain. Great Britain, keep in mind, they've got the strongest army in the world. They just have been defeated. They've been fighting Napoleon for what? 15 years? So they really know how to fight, and we don't even have an army. So, of course, what is this going to require? Call up the militia. And so here comes the call to Governor, this time it's another Governor Blunt, and the call comes to him, and you need to activate your militia and go down to Alabama to avenge the massacre, which is what they're calling it, at Fort Mims. Now, guess who's the Major General of our militia? Andrew Jackson. So in about November 1813, word comes, activate the militia. There's only one small problem. Our Major General has been in a bit of a barroom brawl down on the courthouse square with the Benton brothers, and he has been shot in the shoulder arm, and he can only use one arm right now, and so we have to wait till our Major General can get on his horse before we can go off and fight the Creeks down in Alabama. And there's a lovely painting down at Fayetteville that someone did for some anniversary where they ultimately, Jackson's on a horse and he's got his arm in a sling, but all the troops from East Tennessee are gonna rendezvous with the troops from Middle Tennessee there at Fayetteville before they go chase after the Creeks. And so Andrew Jackson is going to lead the Creeks down into Alabama. And you see there, we've got West Tennessee, and here comes General Jackson. There's several little skirmishes with the Creeks along the way, but the decisive battle is down here in Alabama at, I'm on the wrong river, it's right here, Horseshoe Bend. And it is on the Tallapoosa River. If you've ever been to the Auburn campus, it's very close to the Tallapoosa River. And the National Park Service has a historic site there at Horseshoe Bend. And it is a bloodbath. The Tennessee volunteers are merciless in their killing of the Creeks, and it is a bloodbath. One of the Creek chieftains was not inside this defensive area that they had created, the Creeks, in a bend of the horseshoe bend of the Tallapoosa River. And so he comes to Jackson and actually volunteers to surrender, knowing he's going to probably be tortured and killed. And Jackson was so impressed with him, William Weatherford was the chieftain's name, that he pardons him. But nonetheless, as a result of this victory at Horseshoe Bend, the Creeks and the Chickasaws will be giving up all of their land and moving westward. So look at this map, 1820. The only people holding on that are Native Americans are the Creeks. And they are doing everything. They have now live on farms. They have a constitution. They have a written language. They have elected officials. Their children are baptized and taught by missionaries. They've learned English. They've done everything. And yet it wasn't enough. And so the Battle of Horseshoe Bend is a Creek war with inside this bigger war on top of this that is the War of 1812. Now, you all know something about the War of 1812. It did not go well at all for us. That should not be a surprise to President Madison. And believe it or not, here come the British. They come into Washington, D.C., our beautiful capital. They burn the building. Dolly Madison is eating dinner. The president is off somewhere that night, and she has to get up and leave her food on the table and get rushed out of town because the British are coming, and they burn the president's mansion. So when this is all over, you know what they're going to have to do, like they're doing all over Nashville now. They have to paint the red brick of the president's mansion white. And thus it becomes the White House. But this is not going well. Now, the Americans do stop the British up here in Baltimore at Fort McHenry, but this really says to President Madison, we better cut our losses. And so he will, although he has now made Andrew Jackson a major general in the regular U.S. Army and sit him down to New Orleans in case the British come to go up the Mississippi River there, President Madison decides it's time to talk about settling. And so he will send John Quincy Adams, Albert Gallatin, several other folks over to Ghent, Belgium, to start negotiating peace with the British. Now, meanwhile, Andrew Jackson is down here. He's declared martial law in New Orleans. He has set himself up on a little piece of land down the river just a hair from the city of New Orleans on the Chalmette Plantation, which is right at the mouth of the river. And he's going to put his men there in a defensive struggle. And his army, talk about a motley crew. He's got some of the French folks fighting with him, the pirates, if you want to call them that. He's got Kentucky sharpshooters, Tennessee sharpshooters. He's got a pretty motley crew for his army. And so here come the British. And they don't know when the British are coming, but they know the British are going to come. Now, meanwhile, over at Ghent in Belgium, the treaty is signed on December 24th, 1814. The British Army under Major Pakenham get to New Orleans, or get to Chalmette Plantation on January 8th. There had been some little skirmishes there for a week or so before this big battle, the Battle of New Orleans. But this takes place here. And suddenly, folks, we are on the map. Nashville, Tennessee, because it was one of our own who defeated the British. And he becomes a national hero overnight. Even though the peace treaty had been signed, nobody knew it. So, you know, and in fairness to him, had the British won this battle, I think it's highly possible that they might have just gone on up the Mississippi River and at least gotten as far up as possibly Cairo, Illinois. And what would that have meant? Would they have decided to undo the peace treaty? Who knows what would happen? But overnight, he becomes the second George Washington. The first George Washington defeated the British, and the second George Washington defeated the British. He comes home, he is a hero, the Tennessee Volunteers are a hero, and suddenly everybody in the United States knows the name of this man, Andrew Jackson. He is a hero. And keep in mind, he has been given a lot of credit for pushing the Native Americans out of Alabama, Mississippi, and West Tennessee. So what takes place is land speculation frenzy. Borrow money, do whatever you can, but get over there in West Tennessee as soon as you can and get hold of some of this really good, cheap land. Now, there were 4 people who got the bulk of the land in West Tennessee that had been reserved for the Chickasaws. John Overton, General James Winchester from Sumner County, Andrew Jackson from Nashville, and somebody you've probably never heard of, John Christmas McLemore. He was one of the big landholders over in West Tennessee. And so suddenly they're planning a city on the Mississippi River. Since Winchester had already established a city on the Cumberland River, that was Cairo, which up in Sumner County they call it Cairo. It's now under Old Hickory Lake, but it was Cairo. He founds this town called Cairo, called by them Cairo, and he's going with that Egyptian motif. So the one he's going to create on the Mississippi River will be Memphis. Now, when he died, he thought that Memphis was going to be a failure and that Cairo was going to be his legacy. He was certainly wrong about that, wasn't he? But people are borrowing money. They are borrowing it, because they think as soon as we get the cotton coming, we can pay off our debts. Well, there's a lot of loose banking practices going on, and Nashville has some unregulated banks here. And so suddenly we have our first big national recession, the Panic of 1819. William Carroll, who was second in command at the Battle of New Orleans, a man from Pennsylvania who had come to Nashville with his family when they migrated south, he invests in a steamboat. Guess what he names his steamboat? Andrew Jackson. And it's one of these side paddle wheel steamboats. Remember, the steamboats had just started coming down the Mississippi River in 1811 and 1812. So he has invested in this steamboat, and he's going to go bankrupt because of this panic. And I'll tell you, getting a steamboat from Paducah, Kentucky to Nashville had to be a harrowing experience because there are several places along the way where the rocks come up just below the surface of the water, and so they caught steamboats there all the time. Carroll had invested in the building of another steamboat named James Robertson, and it had a few voyages before it sank on these shoals, is what these rocks are called, and it sank there. And General Lafayette came here in the 1820s on his kind of farewell tour to the United States. Big events in Nashville. And he, on his steamboat going back down the river, the steamboat crashed on the Harpeth Shoals, and he and all the passengers had to be rescued from the sinking steamboat. So it was a hazardous thing, and he's going bankrupt. All right, what do people do? Even in 1819, what do people do if they suddenly see that them and their neighbors have some grievances or some problems? If they have some problems, they call for the government to help them. And here we've got this state government here in Tennessee that, the legislators are very what shall I say, in 1819, they are very wary of spending much money, and yet they see these people who have borrowed all this money and their property is being foreclosed on. So these people go to the legislature. Our governor is Joseph McMinn by this time. They go to him and the legislature and say, could you just get the banks to extend the deadline for foreclosure a year or two. That's called a stay law. Stay my debt for another year or two till we can get the cotton crop and get the price of cotton back up again. And why was there such a depression in 1819? Part of it was because of overproduction of cotton with all this new cotton land. So they go to the legislature, and the legislature has some sympathy for this. And the legislature gets a letter from none other than the hero of the nation, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson says, don't do it. Don't let those people borrow that money. They took the risk. Let them suffer. He was against the stay laws. The legislature passed it anyway. The Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional, but mercifully, the recession ended, and this is when Nashville booms. You've got the 1-2 whammy of success. You've got a hero who gets lots of national attention. You've got steamboats coming up. This city becomes a trading hub. Up and down Broadway, you can see carts, farmers taking things to the steamboats. You see Market Street really thriving with this steamboat energy that is coming. It brings things and new ideas into the area. And so here, suddenly, Nashville becomes not just this frontier outpost in the middle of nowhere. It suddenly becomes a major city. And this is when the churches really start taking much more, the denominations, much more of an interest in what's going on here. Now, the Presbyterians had finally gotten a church established in Nashville in 1814. Now, guess where General Jackson and most of the men were? Down in Alabama. But they had gotten a Presbyterian church founded, which becomes First Presbyterian Church. At their organizing meeting, they had 6 women and 1 man. Religion didn't take quite as fast with the men as it did with the women, because they were out doing lots of other manly things here. But here you see what the city looked like. Now, here we're on the river, and if you kind of move up here, you will see Vine Street right here, High Street right here, and Spring Street, which leads to a spring down here, will become Church Street. And the Baptist found this church because Reverend Whitsitt decides it's time for a Baptist church to be in town. And so they have an evangelist come. He preaches some sermons. There's some interest in hiring the evangelist, but that does not work out. Some did not like this evangelist. And so here they will start looking for a minister, and they find none other than Philip Fall. And he is going to come to Nashville from Kentucky. He was very well known in Kentucky. He was a young man. He was interested in a lot of different things, but he is going to come. The first pastor had already made the decision that maybe we should withdraw from that Concord Baptist Convention. And so here you've got this church here, you've got this structure, and the first pastor's going to die, and so they start looking at Philip Fall. And Philip Fall doesn't really think he wants to come down here. He apparently has some health issues. He declines it, but then he decides he's going to come anyway. He's, at this time, coincidentally, I think one of the things that enticed him, he was offered a job at the Nashville Female Academy. And so he comes. He is a devotee to the ideas of Alexander Campbell. He's Alexander Campbell, by the way, an ordained Presbyterian minister. But Philip Fall, a Baptist, comes to Nashville and begins his pastorate of this church. And the church does decide to endorse and accept and incorporate many of the ideas of Alexander Campbell. And these ideas are not really, looking at the church the way the church today is pretty flexible, but in 1820 something, these were subjects of great debate. Are you going to serve communion every Sunday? And Campbell's idea was, yes, you are going to serve communion every Sunday. It's the New Testament church here, and we're going to serve communion because this ties us all together. And then another thing that seemed to be a huge sticking point was when somebody joined the church, do you do the asking to test their faith in front of the whole congregation, or do you take them back here in the back where just the deacons do the asking of the questions to examine a candidate for baptism? And this distresses some of the members of the Vine Street, what becomes the Vine Street Church. But most of the members of the church really liked Philip Fall, and they really supported these ideas and had supported them before Fall ever came. So 6 people will leave the church, and they will found the First Baptist Church, and Vine Street will indeed become the Christian church. And so here we have Alexander Campbell in and out quite regularly. 2 of his daughters marry 2 young men who were the sons of the clerk of the Vine Street Church. He is in this church quite often. He will go out to the Hermitage and have dinner with General Jackson and enjoy the company of him. And he calls Nashville the golden candlestick of the Lord. We haven't advanced to the buckle of the Bible belt at this point in time. It is the golden candlestick for the Lord. And so this congregation was planted. And soon you're going to see here on this block, you're going to see Vine Street, you're going to see the Vine Street Temple, you're going to see McKendree a block away and the Presbyterian Church a block away. And Spring Street will become Church Street. But suddenly, Nashville is a proper city. It's got theatrical companies, opera will come. It's got a first-rate educational system because in 1824, the founders and leaders, our founders are mostly all gone by this point, but the leaders of the community decide that they want to try to get a college going here again, and they convince Philip Lindsley, who is in New Jersey, he's a Presbyterian minister and an educator, to come and reopen a college here on College Hill. Think about where Howard School is, and that's where College Hill was, the University of Nashville. He comes with the condition that he can rename it. He doesn't want it to be called Davidson College or Cumberland College. He wants it to be the University of Nashville. And over the next 20 years, he will put together the finest faculty in the South. By all accounts, he recruited a first-rate faculty. It had a robust engineering department. They will eventually have a medical department. They are unionists because they are from the North, and they keep the university open during the Civil War, but only to have it have to close for financial reasons after the Civil War ended. But here we've got Vine Street, 200 years of this history. And it is a really, really important story that everybody here needs to know about. Thank you very much. Now, I can take some questions. You may, if you have your lights on a timer, they may all go out on us, but surely not. It's just, anybody have any comments or questions? Anybody trace your ancestry back that far? And what was the family name? Not that I would know.
It was the mayor of Nashville that was Jackson's opponent, and their family, I think it's like Stringfield or something.
Yeah, okay. Well, there are a few folks around. Most of us are transplants like me, but there are definitely some folks who trace their ancestry all the way back to those very early days. And I think there's really a lot about the church that any church, not just this one, but any church. I mean, your records are probably like our records at Westminster. Ours are at the State Archives. Yours are at the Disciples Archives. But, you know, Westminster was founded as a mission of First Pres after the Civil War. So we had to contend with a lot of other things, but we certainly didn't have to contend with slavery. And so I would imagine that sometime when somebody has the time to go through those records up at Bethany, where they are now, that you'll find some interesting things about the enslaved population that belonged to some of the members of the church. So I think there's a very fruitful source of information if it can ever just be dug out.
Was Charlotte also considered to be the capital of Tennessee?
Charlotte was not. Now, Kingston over in West Tennessee was the capital. Murfreesboro was the capital. And for a while, Knoxville, you know, for a while it was Knoxville, Nashville, but then the population over here got so much bigger than over there that it suddenly was over here. And when we rewrote the Constitution of the state in 1834, we still didn't have a permanent capital. Now, the reason it was in Kingston for one day is this was really low. But in signing a treaty, one of the many treaties we signed with the Cherokees, and there's a list of probably, 20 treaties probably. And one of the things they wanted the state capital further west so that they could get to it better. Something had to do with that. And so the legislature passed a bill to move it to Kingston, but they tricked the Cherokees because in the bill, it was only for one day. So then they went back to Knoxville. And in 1843, the legislature still had not picked a capital. 1843. And it was bouncing around depending on the governor's wishes. Well, so they hire a geologist from the University of Nashville to find the geographic center of the state. And it's kind of anywhere but Nashville. By this time, you've got West Tennessee going. And West Tennessee sure doesn't want it in Nashville, but they don't want to drive to Knoxville or ride their horse to Knoxville. And the same is true of people in West Tennessee. And so they find the geographic center, and it is over there in Rutherford County. There's a marker to it on the MTSU campus, but they couldn't put the capital in Rutherford County, the geographic center of the state. You know why? Because you can't get a steamboat up the Stones River. And so much to the dismay of many people who were in the anywhere but Nashville movement, they did, in fact, decide to locate the capital in Nashville. And the city of Nashville donated this hill, the Cedar Knob, Campbell's Knob, to the state for the building of this capital, which is the oldest working capital in the United States, state capital. Most of them have built bigger and grander capitals, but we have the oldest. And of course, if you count the Legislative Plaza and all of that as part of the Capitol, we've expanded state government tremendously by doing that. But one funny thing about what was taking place at this anti-Nashville movement, West Tennessee decided they were going to secede from Tennessee in the early 1840s and create their own state, and they were going to name their state Jacksoniana. And so over in East Tennessee, they have a state legislator whose name is Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson says, well, if y'all are going to secede, we're going to secede and create the state of Franklin, Part 2. And so you know what the legislative delegation from Nashville did to stop this? They started passing bills to build roads in both of these places, and the secession movement was silenced at that point in time. All right, Martha, I've talked a little bit over.
If you have questions, it would be best to go to the mic that's in the center aisle.
Anybody have a question or a comment? A lot of that was, well, no, it's not. I mean, it's all about, personalities and political power. And over there you have a mayor of Memphis named Edward Crump, and we have a mayor in Nashville, Hillary House. Now, they both had a lot of things in common, but the one thing they really had in common was they were both opposed to prohibition. And so when Thomas Rye gets elected governor, he gets the legislature to pass a law that we're gonna remove from office these people who don't enforce the prohibition laws. And yeah, somebody, this is history humor. We had a governor who was a prohibitionist, a dry named Rye. And so, nonetheless, both of these men are removed from office. They are ousted. Well, Hillary House sits out a term or two and then comes back in. We vote him in again. We loved Hillary House here. He runs another 10 or so years as mayor. But Crump never wanted to get involved in politics. He had one term in the House of Representatives and didn't like it. And what he wanted to do was manage politics. And that's what he did. His real goal was to make sure that Memphis got its fair share of the political pie. But because we have over here some pretty strong personalities, and one of the strong ones over here is Luke Lee. So you've kind of Luke Lee. And, he was a U.S. Senator. He owned the Tennessean. He was a partner of Rogers Caldwell. He was a very visible man. He was a big personality. And so you've got sort of over there, it's Crump versus Lee. And so the legislature is kind of at this tug of war because Lee supported prohibition and Crump didn't. But it was that boss Crump, and he controlled all of the politics really in the state until 1948 when Al Gore, no, it was Estes Kefauver was elected senator, and that election of 1848 broke the back. I heard John Siegenthaler say this about 1,000 times. It was that election that broke the back of the Crump machine. And so they lost their power base then. But now it really is rural versus urban, it seems to me. It's kind of Memphis and Nashville and Knoxville and Chattanooga, and kind of rural Tennessee seems to have a louder voice in the legislature than the cities. But that whole case of Baker versus Carr is really a fascinating case. Cyril.
So I just wanted to see if I got this right. What I thought I heard you say was that the Baptists started the church on Vine Street, and then they had a division, a lot of it because of the Alexander Campbell influence, so they left that site to Vine Street Christian and moved down the street for First Baptist.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Well, the remnant departed, and no, they had I think they'd had a temporary place on Broadway for a while, but it really is a kind of an interesting thing that the congregation was Vine Street and is this congregation, and the Baptists had to start all over. And luckily, somewhere along the way, very quickly before the Civil War, they got R.B.C. Howell as their pastor, who's a very famous Baptist preacher, and he sort of rejuvenated the congregation, but they had 6 people left who were not going to participate in this. And so, people will always tell me, "Oh, I'm not interested in politics. I have no interest in politics." And I say, "Well, are you a member of a church?" And they say, Yes, and so, churches are as political as any institution ever was. So, churches have their ups and downs, masks, no mask, guitars and banjos in the worship service. You'd be surprised what church people can fight about. There's a lot. Any other questions here? Yes.
So Vine Street Christian Church shares the same lot as Vine Street Temple?
Yes, and I'll show you a pic.
Was there a lot of harmony between those two congregations?
Well, yes, I think there was.
They can't hear that on the stream. Would you repeat it, please?
Okay. The question is Vine Street Synagogue, the temple, was next door to Vine Street Christian. Now, you're going to see a picture next week of the Vine Street Church that was next door. And I mean, it was really quite a beautiful church facing Vine Street. So imagine the parking garage at the 7th Avenue entrance to the parking garage at the public library. And on that corner, you had the Vine Street Synagogue and the Vine Street Church. Now, the synagogue left first because there was a tornado in, I think, maybe 52 that, it had those beautiful onion domes on it. It was just gorgeous, and it took a big hit from that. And so it left, that congregation moved way out to Belmead. But yes, they were sitting right there next to each other. And that congregation has a really interesting history because the first Jews who came to Nashville before the Civil War were German Jews, and they were ones who wanted to blend into the culture. And so they got established here very early. If you know a lawyer named Harris Gilbert's ancestors were some of these original Jews from, I think they came maybe from Cincinnati. And then, about 1890s and 1900s, not only do you have Ellis Island in New York and Angel Island in San Francisco, but New Orleans is a huge port of entry for immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and Russia. And so there are a lot of Jews who come up the Mississippi River. A very large population stayed in Memphis and founded the Baron Hirsch Synagogue there. And there were synagogues all over West Tennessee, well, not all over the place, but Brownsville. There are a few synagogues in West Tennessee, none of which are there anymore. In Alabama and Mississippi, the same way. But you had some of those Eastern European Jews coming to Nashville who were Orthodox. But these two congregations were there together. And there was another congregation, the Gay Street Synagogue, was more conservative than the Vine Street Temple, and they were up near Market Street, Cyril. So they were up there. So you had these. We have three at one point early on. We had three Jewish congregations, and they have a beautiful cemetery. It's small but gorgeous. If you've never been up there, it's on Clay Street, just above Fisk, and they've got 2 or possibly 3 cemeteries there because, there's some fences, but it's a lovely synagogue, it's a lovely cemetery, but each congregation wanted its own cemetery. So but the one that Vine Street had, which is now the temple, is the largest one. There's a lot of history in all of these denominations. The Episcopalians of the Protestants were about the last to get here, and they were kind of English, and so that was why they were the last to get here. But as Martha said, when Vine Street was founded, we're getting this proper burial ground. It's a cemetery. Boston has established Mount Auburn Cemetery, and you're getting a proper burial ground, not just a burial ground, it's a cemetery. It's a park-like place, and the city cemetery is really, really quite beautiful today. Go out there. I'm really proud of the work that has taken place out there. And another thing the city got in 1820, started in 1820, and then finished in 1822, was the first bridge over the Cumberland River. And in order to find labor, enough labor to build the bridge, it was a covered bridge, and it was not that far above the level of the water. They had to bring Irish immigrants from the Northeast here, and so one of the ways they got the Irish to come as laborers was to promise to build them a Catholic church, which they built St. Mary's, which was on the northeast corner of the property of the state capitol, and then they built that church a little bit later, the St. Mary's of the Seven Sorrows. They built that church for them, but the first bridge, so see, Nashville's getting a bridge, we've got steamboat, we've got trade, we've got all these activities, and it's becoming the gateway, it's becoming a real economic commercial hub.
Could the steamboats go under the bridge if it was
Well,
that low?
well, the low ones could, but that's why they had to destroy the bridge. Because it was too low. So the bridge got destroyed, got ultimately destroyed, and then one of the bridges got burned by the Confederates as they were departing from town so that the Yankees would not be using the bridge, but that did not stop the Union Army anyway. But the bridge was too low. The steamboat, when they got taller, you know, these first steamboats were really basically a raft with a steam engine on it and a paddle wheel on the side. Lots of steamboat explosions too. Those steam engines weren't perfect.
Keel boats were
Yeah.
used before
Yeah.
the steamboats, and they were kind of dangerous because they would tip over
Yeah,
easily.
Yeah, and there's not a lot of way to maneuver one of those either. Any other comments, questions? Well, thank you all so much for coming. I greatly appreciate it, and I'm honored that you are here. And as you see, I've got an email address up here, so you can, if you want to send me some information about something you know about that you think I would like to know about, or you want me to share with the others next week, by all means, let me hear from you. I'm around, and I'm delighted to always talk about Nashville history. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you, Carol, for the depth and breadth of your knowledge is amazing, and we're grateful that you would share it with us. So don't forget, next week we'll be doing this again next Wednesday night at 7, and we'll hear about Nashville in the 1920s. So thank you all for being here, and hope to see you next week.